I would like to go see one, to now where everybody you know makes some documentaries. Everywhere you go on YouTube, you will see documentaries, good and bad. We're now in this very sophisticated moment where we can understand difficult and challenging documentaries and new techniques and new forms of art. So you guys have that responsibility now to be like a composer who is going to take piano music forward and do something new with it. I think that's where we are with digital video. I think you guys can now take it to where you can make something remarkable and the audience will get it. So that is my short talk about short documentaries. I love to talk to you guys on all these. And I also want to encourage those of you who don't like documentaries, I always have a few students who don't, to maybe look at it from a new angle. Documentary doesn't necessarily mean a news broadcast or something to persuade you. It can be something that comes entirely out of the ideas of art too. So I always encourage students to say, I'm bored by documentaries, I don't like it. I encourage them to say, don't call it that, call it art films. Let's make films that are art. Let's call it nonfiction. Let's call it personal films. And I think for those of you who, your first reaction is, oh, documentaries, maybe just turn your language around a little. I think you might find something you like. Okay, thank you all for having me on the call. I'd love to talk to you and answer any questions we can.
So does anybody have a question to Ted? Now is the time to do it.
Hello, I have a question.
All right.
When you do a documentary, you imagine first the script, or where are you going to film? Like,
Okay.
what is first?
Well, there are people who work many different ways. For me, I often want to know the story, and that doesn't mean I know everything that someone will tell me or that happened. I want to know about a decision. So if, like right now, we're working with women and men who were involved in a civil rights sit-in in 1969. So they're all 70 some years old. And what I find myself asking them is, when did you decide to actually take over the building? So moments like that, when they made a big decision, that's what I look at in the story. So for me, you can't script everything, but you can say, I think the overall thing that happened is like this, and that person's the character who did it. When did they decide to do this thing? What made them decide it? So that's what I try to do. Even if that's just a few sentences, that's the story I look for. I have had some students who try to write down everything they want somebody to say, and the person never says that exactly. So you can go too far with a script sometimes. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Do you make
Alejandro.
documentaries?
I like to make scripts, so yeah.
Okay. Well, there is a growth right now in what is a documentary, and some people do things that have recreations or have other parts. There's a lot of people who've now said, I will combine nonfiction with the tools of fiction. There's some great films that have done that. So there's room for people who script writing is their main thing. There's room for that, for sure.
Thank you, Alejandro. Does somebody else have another question?
Is anybody going on to graduate school at this point? Are you continuing on with, or just glad to be done?
I think most of them are in their last semester, so they are almost done, hopefully, right?
I just had several students graduate, and they all have very different opinions, whether they never want to go to school again or they want to go to graduate school and go further. And it changes every day. I get different answers from them every day, which way they're going. So I think it's an interesting moment for everybody.
Yeah, it definitely is. So Ted, I have a question. How do you pick your characters? I mean, maybe you have an interesting topic, but sometimes some characters work and sometimes they don't. How do you do it?
It's a good question. I really grew up without much of the arts in my life. My dad was a factory worker and wasn't interested in the arts. Generally, he liked some music. So when I became a photographer, I found myself always talking to artists. I wanted to know about the person who made clay or painted. It was so outside of my growing up experience, and it was so rich. So first, I'm always attracted to any artist who wants to participate in a documentary. What they do is just fascinating. But I also find that I like any story where someone makes a difficult decision. That's what really gets my excitement. Whatever, even if somebody just does something that's they're in a job that's not exciting, they didn't do something that's that spectacular, but they made a decision. That's what I like to know about. Once you find that out for someone, that's something we all relate to. You know, even if the film is 1 minute, I'm looking for anybody to tell me how they made a decision, because that's one thing documentary does that fiction has a harder time with. We relate to somebody, whatever they chose, they make a decision. We go, oh, I can feel that. I could be in that same situation or relate to something I did.
Yeah, definitely. So that could be like in a fiction, if we talk about the conflict, right?
Yeah.
Decisions, how you turn on and that.
Exactly. And I always say I think no one grows up with this, because we all have watched, most of us have watched a lot of fiction. I always say that nonfiction has more fascinating conflict in it usually, because in a fiction, anything could happen. This person fights that person. Okay. But in real life, there's a little bit of amazement just when someone does anything. You know, it's real. That's what happened usually. So I like conflict there. If somebody can tell us what they were fighting against, it's usually something we go, oh, I really feel that story. So.
Right, thank you. Yeah, in classes, we were always talking about conflict. If we don't have a conflict, we don't have a story.
Well, in this civil rights documentary we're working on right now, we weren't sure how to handle that, because as 50 years have passed, no one wants to say, well, I didn't support civil rights. You know, you wouldn't find somebody who wants to tell you that on camera. And so we were wondering, well, we have people who wanted to work towards civil rights, obviously. Who and how will we represent the idea that the society didn't want to change? So as we're starting to edit, it becomes a big question. Where is the conflict? Someone wanted to change it. And with any social documentary, people, especially in the past, they'll say, well, that problem is solved now. So it's one of the things I'm thinking about in this edit right now is, how do you show that human beings struggle with change, and human beings often go along with society, and maybe as time passes, they realize I was wrong, but no one wants to be on the wrong side of that. So where that conflict is actually the biggest editing question in this film.
And maybe another conflict when you edit, it's how do you link all those stories that you have now? I mean, you are going looking for that conflict of the story, but also how to make the narrative of all these discourses that you have. Right.
My favorite documentary, I answer differently about my favorite all the time, but my favorite documentary today is a film by Errol Morris called Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. And he interviewed 4 people who had very unusual jobs, and we start to see them talking about their job, and we start to see what you would call B-roll, footage of them doing their jobs or related things. And what happens in that movie is, at first it's obvious. This person trims shrubs, that person tames tigers, and we see someone doing that. But as the film goes, we start to see the stories overlap. And after you're watching it, it no longer matters that we're hearing the man who's a lion tamer